right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Everyone, thanks so much for joining our panel today on accelerating responsible AI in regulated industries. We're so excited to have you all here. We have an incredible moderator and group of panelists joining us today. I'm Patrick. I'm the Member Engagement Manager at the Responsible AI Institute. And every month we have these Responsible AI Institute virtual event series where we talk about a specific topic related on responsible AI. So without further ado, I will hand things off to our moderator for today's session, Greg Wolf.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you, Patrick, and the Responsible AI Institute for inviting us here today. And panelists, what a great opportunity to be here with all of you, and you've got some really amazing perspectives. Our focus today is going to be on the transition of AI from concept to practical application. AI is all around us. We've seen it. And as we're starting to move into the world of moving out of theoretical concepts, out of the lab and into the real world applications, we're going to focus today on three core challenges that are essential for advancing AI adoption to the next level. Firstly, ensuring that AI benefits humanity. We want to make sure that these solutions are prioritized for the well-being and best interests of humanity. Secondly, responsible AI applications, especially in critical industries. When you think about the priority of protecting consumers and society in general, especially in industries where AI can cause the most significant harm, financial services, healthcare, energy, transportation, telecommunications. How do we harness this capability without hurting people and society at large? Number three, aligning AI with regulatory standards. Ultimately, AI in these industries especially has to comply with regulatory requirements. The challenge, of course, it's evolving so quickly. And as we know, regulations tend to lag industry by months or sometimes even years. So how do we prevent unintended consequences from AI and make sure that we're aligned with the regulatory environment? So throughout our discussion, we're going to be looking at actionable insights. We have an amazing panel here who come from a broad and diverse perspective in regulated and mission-critical industries. And so looking forward to providing some insights from you folks and hearing from you folks about adopting AI responsibly, ethically, and in alignment with both societal and regulatory expectations. Before we get started, a little bit of a background. I'm introduce myself. My name is Greg Wolf. I'm at the AI think tank, the AI Reg Risk think tank. Originally, I'm from South Africa, so you can stop guessing on the accent. Started my career 20-something years ago at PwC in Boston in the risk and assurance practice. And since then, I've founded numerous data analytics and AI companies in regulated industries. 6 years ago, I started an AI think tank, co-founded it actually, because we saw an opportunity to get regulated institutions, technologists, and government agencies in a room to talk about AI. Keep in mind, this is AI 6 years ago, which is nothing like it is today with generative AI. And those conversations actually culminated with us being invited down to DC and briefing the Senate Banking Committee on using AI for anti-money laundering, which ultimately made it into our recommendation made it into an act of Congress. So clearly the industry perspective and the industry input does have an effect on the regulations. Since then, we've been advising regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, telco, energy, and transportation on adopting responsible AI solutions with our AI strategy and risk program. And I'm delighted today to introduce the rest of our panelists. So we'll start out with Brian.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Thanks, Greg. So today I work for the Bank Policy Institute on emerging technology risk management issues. I have to do the legal thing. These are my opinions, not the Bank Policy Institute's or our members. Prior to that, I was a chief security officer and then worked at EY for a couple of years, working with boards and corporate officers on their risk strategies, mostly cyber, but also leaning into emerging tech issues, and an advisor at the Reg Risk think tank.
Perfect. Welcome. Julie?
Hi, thank you. So my name is Julie Novic, and I am a PhD anthropologist who focused on economic theory for 16 years through the anthropological lens. And then I made a shift into data science, and I joined a company called Pandata, which focused on responsible implementations and development for regulated industries. After that, I did a brief stint in the entrepreneurial space, working with venture studios and startups before coming to Further, where I currently am as an AI strategist, working to help organizations identify key places where they can implement and use AI in a responsible manner, and also how to govern that process.
Terrific. Thank you. Oops, can't you mute it? Flip it around.
Sorry, first one of the day. Yeah, I'm Ken Sokolov. I'm the Senior Data Architect in Chevron. Helped to found the RAI program within Chevron in 2021, and also primarily connected in my role as architect with the law function inside of Chevron.
Excellent. Welcome. Thanks for being with us. And Phil.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with all these panelists and see so many attending. Thanks to Ray for organizing. I'm the head of policy and customer development at Armilla AI. I'm a background lawyer. I've been working in the AI space for about 6 or 7 years, mainly on the policy side, and so I've been a part of and seen some of the foundational initiatives on AI policy and responsible AI from the very beginning, with the development of the OECD principles and some of the key foundational standards that I'm sure we'll be discussing more later today.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you for being here. So what I love about this group is that we actually have a really eclectic combination of technical, ethics, humanitarian, legal, anthropological perspectives. So I think this is going to be really interesting because AI has created so many questions. Brian, let's kick it off with you in the financial services space. Financial services industry, of course, is one of the most regulated industries, but also you've done a lot of work with some of the top banks, like the top 40 banks, right? And you're seeing a lot of adoption. Why do you believe this is the case? And what kind of approaches are firms taking in this industry?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. The thing that they're leaning on most is they have incredibly mature risk practices that can be distinguished from other industries. And having worked at EY and assessed risk programs across a wide group of industries, the difference is that they are incredibly programmatic versus what we see in other industries is they tend to have risk processes and risk tools, but not necessarily this kind of nimble risk management that moves and swells with change. But they're able to do that because they're incredibly programmatic with it. So, when GPT was released, right, there are hundreds of use cases thrown at them, and they were quickly able to, bring that into their processes that were stable, right? They were able to handle the speed and the necessity for change. They were quick to adapt centers of excellence, which did not necessarily turn into a governance body, right? As much as it was there to support the already existing governance structures of oversight, operational governance, and their risk practices. So they're able to kind of harness this central knowledge of what is AI, what do we do, how do these models work, right? What's the use cases? What's the heat map of value versus risk? And they were able to do that incredibly quickly because their risk practice was stable. And you can't, from what I've seen out of the industries, this ad hoc approach is slow. It's inconsistent. It's not trustworthy in a lot of ways, and it certainly is not nimble enough to handle this. So I think they were able to look at this and adapt and pull it in, absorb it quickly, and assess, and now provide these use cases. And of course, there's pressure in markets, and just real quick, when we talk with a lot of the CIOs, some of their responses, their top risks are moving too slow. And that's coming from a lot of places, right? The need and the desire and the tools and how you have to adapt. And so, pulling that in quickly, understanding pressures of getting to market, of understanding use cases and risks, They were really in a unique position, I think, than other industries that I've seen.
Interesting. So it's kind of counterintuitive in a way that, highly regulated, yet actually set them up, the financial industry, for better adoption. When you say they in these organizations, what level do you see as appropriately kind of jumping onto this risk-enabled strategy? Is it down to the data scientist level, of providing the tools to make sure that they don't do things untoward? Where in the organization are you seeing kind of adoption, and what do you think is the right way for an organization to adopt this strategy?
Yeah, no, this is coming from an executive level, right? Of, how to establish, first risk practice, right? Yeah, you can throw all the use cases you want at us, but if we don't go through a process of understanding downside and upside and understanding the balance and, measuring it against our core assets like trust, right? If you can't do that, then you can throw all the use cases against the wall that you want. And that's that would be a bottom-up approach, where their first instinct was establish governance, establish the risk practice, pull it into existing risk practices. That to me was that was a differentiator. And from a regulatory standpoint, look, they face a lot of regulation, and we'll probably talk about it later, but there's a lot to learn from the cyberspace and what's occurred, and eventually, the focus on governance and risk management. The regulators are paying attention. Where they're starting is governance and risk management, unlike, what we've seen historically with cyber, which was good practice, good hygiene, dot your I's, cross your T's, these are standards, be compliant.
Makes sense, yeah. So Ken, kicking over to you in the energy sector, obviously another highly regulated space where the impact of adverse effects could be really catastrophic. How do you see AI being used in this space? And what's important to get a proper grip of AI use cases in a large energy organization and managing the associated risk that Brian speaks of?
Sure. Actually, Chevron's history with machine learning goes quite far back. So there was ample precedent as AI emerged for addressing these issues. Just the obvious fact that any industry that's involved, and particularly an energy industry, in process engineering, has been on the cusp with machine learning of where we are with AI now. And so being a highly regulated industry, we had a lot of practices in place already. We didn't have to build something from the ground up. And when we recognized these emerging issues around responsible AI, our key question really was, at first, do we want to build something, as Brian suggested, ad hoc, or do we want to integrate these new kinds of risks and emerging compliance responsibilities into the systems we have? And it was much more efficient for us to integrate that into things that we already have. Additionally, go ahead.
No, please continue.
Yeah, and I think additionally, we saw, and I think Brian alluded to this as well, we saw early on that even if it hasn't quite reached the stage yet, it was going to become another compliance function that an organization would have to perform. And so we built that with that in mind, even if it hasn't gotten to where cyber is, or data privacy, or just managing oil pipelines. But we know that's where it's going, or we're quite convinced that's where it's going. So it was around that mostly. And to the question, additionally, of where we use it, Chevron uses it everywhere. It's not isolated, to any specific thing. We can find it in HR, we can find it in corporate affairs, we can find it in finance, and any large company will see that. I mean, but we have, because of as noted in like the EU AI Act, particular responsibilities in the area of energy and safe production of energy. So that becomes a particular emphasis for us that other groups don't have. But I would think that any regulated industry has things they have to focus on because of the industry they're in. But it doesn't mean that that's the only place they're using AI.
So that's a reinforcement of what Brian is saying, right? A large, mature, robust risk management infrastructure, and sounds like what you're doing is creating an extension of that and adopting AI, just like any new technology, social, mobile, cloud. We've all seen these come through the organization and the enterprise over the last 20 years. When you say AI is being adopted everywhere, are we talking about the kind of the analytical, deterministic, traditional AI, or are we talking about generative AI?
Both. Both. We see opportunities to, if you're a large organization, and this would be, I would think, characteristic of any large organization. Just take, for instance, the issue of in HR, you get a ton of resumes through the door. How are you going to handle that? Now, that's not unique to Chevron, and it's not unique to the energy sector. It's characteristic of any large organization. So how do you manage that? Can you find a responsible way of using artificial intelligence, in this case generative AI, to help manage that and still keep things responsible, that it involves the ongoing proper protection for individuals. And it may not be Chevron's specialty, but it is part of doing business and part of doing business responsibly. So we find uses everywhere for generative capabilities. And just on the opposite side, when it comes to things specifically in the energy sector, we have massive numbers of drawings historically, and massive number of contracts and things like that, all of which relate to trying to build a picture to do things more efficiently. And there is high potential of generative AI in that space as well.
Very, very interesting. So like financial services, hundreds of use cases, right? Julie, let's transition a little bit to healthcare, right? Also highly regulated, but traditionally slower at adopting technology. Are you seeing the same benefits of having a robust risk management infrastructure, allowing them to kind of piggyback on top of that and leapfrog and move things forward? Or what kind of obstacles are you seeing in that space?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to that. So yes, to echo the story that we're hearing so far, it is having that regulatory framework that's already in place, having those processes in place and building upon them that causes success and adoption in these industries. And healthcare is no stranger to that. And while, I kind of I haven't been seeing the slowness as being as slow as some people may view for healthcare in the healthcare space. There is, because we're dealing with human lives, there is an element of the flashy, the name drawing use cases like clinical decision support, like the AlphaFold, then the recent Nobel Prize winning project. Those kinds of initiatives, yes, there is a slowness to push those forward in adoption, but there's a lot of innovation happening in what we're thinking of as efficiency plays. So ways of reducing, for example, doctor and caregiver burnout by helping them be able to process through documentation quicker, to be able to summarize and draft letters and notes, things that require a little bit of human oversight to be done, to double check the work, but that can be move things faster from an administrative perspective. those places we've been seeing for years traditional AI being implemented, and doing so in very responsible in ways that conform to the regulations that are in place, like HIPAA. So I kind of, yes, and it's not as slow as people think.
That's very encouraging. As a human being, I think I'm still a human being. This is not a bot. I very obviously have a vested interest in hearing about new drug discoveries and therapies and advances in healthcare. Obviously, safety is a major concern. But if we look at the flip side of that, the cost infrastructure in healthcare is challenging. I was going to say disastrous, but I decided to say challenging, right? Phil, you're on the insurance side, right? And obviously, this, insurance is pretty broad in terms of health insurance and a whole lot of other spaces. What does it look like to you from an insurance perspective in terms of AI adoption? We hear that actually that that insurance is an industry which is actually really could really benefit from optimizations and efficiencies that Julie spoke of. What are you seeing in the market, and is this kind of thesis of having existing risk and compliance infrastructure in place enabling as opposed to creating friction and slowness?
Yeah, thanks very much, Greg. And I've really been enjoying the interventions from the panelists. I'll just maybe say a couple of words clarifying a little bit of where my company, Armilla, is situated. We do a lot of work in the insurance industry with insurtechs who are selling AI-powered products to carriers. And we work with carriers as well. But we also are pioneering insurance solutions for AI risk and performance. So we provide automated testing and risk assessments for AI and generative AI applications, and we can insure them. And we do this with global insurers. So we have an interesting vantage point because we're also working in healthcare and in banking. And then the focus of what I'll share today is about our experience in the insurance industry. And I'll say this: the insurance industry has, I think, under the radar seen, and that's my view, under the radar seen some of the highest pace of regulatory activity, I think, in I'll say North America. You do have the EU AI Act, which introduces new obligations for life and health insurers, categorizing them as high risk applications. So there's new binding obligations for insurers in the EU. There's similar obligations for life and health insurers in the state of Colorado. There's new guidance that has been released by the state insurance commissioner in New York, including new rules for fairness testing. And then there's the national, the NAIC, the national body that sets standards for the insurance commission, for the state insurance commissioners, has adopted a model bulletin on insurers' use of AI. And the core is really about risk management being adapted to AI risk. Insurers like banks and financial institutions do have a sophisticated infrastructure for risk management already. It's a matter of understanding what new approaches and procedures might be relevant because of the adoption of AI. And then I would say, in terms of how insurers are grappling with these changes, it's split a little bit more in terms of, I would say, the size and I would say state of digital transformation of the particular organization, right? So if we're talking about the top 10 to 20 global insurers, many have been using have large data science teams using algorithms, AI, machine learning, and now experimenting and even using generative AI more actively. And then there's for a certain kind of swath of the industry, that's just not the case. It's a little newer, so these rules are a little bit more challenging to grapple with. And then I think I'll make one comment before, I know we have a few other topics to get to, but there's something that came up from the other panelists I think is applicable for the insurance industry. I think I see it in banking as well. I'd love to hear others' thoughts as the conversation evolves. like it's something Kent mentioned, something we're not necessarily seeing large and even sophisticated enterprises who are adopting AI look very closely just yet at third-party AI solutions. Kent mentioned hiring, for instance. There are new laws in New York mandating bias audits of these systems, but we see sophisticated financial institutions with model risk management policies that are not necessarily grouping third-party AI tools that might otherwise be classified as high risk into those model risk management policies and applying to them the same kind of rigor in model validation and testing that they do for the solutions they're building. So that's something where I'm seeing as a commonality across the board, and including in the insurance industry.
So yeah, I mean, so you speak about putting a price on risk, right? And that's kind of fascinating, because we've all spoken about having a risk management infrastructure in place is critical and key to enabling AI adoption. How does one put a price on risk around AI, given that it's so new? I mean, it sounds like ensuring that space is particularly it's got to be challenging, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it absolutely is a challenge. It's new, but a key part of how we go about doing this is performing both a qualitative and quantitative assessment of the AI system. We're looking at dimensions of trustworthiness, performance, quantifying performance, and probability of deviation from standard operations. So it is a kind of a new and evolving assessment process that we undertake, and that feeds directly into our underwriting model. So it's something that we've been building out, in collaboration with our insurance partners for a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly this, managing the risk around AI seems like a topic that's really going to be key to faster, rapid adoption to provide. So let's get into
Hey, Greg,
that a little bit.
So just real quick, a question, if I could, on,
Please.
What's the value of risk? What's the value of strategy? Right. And that is where I think you're starting to see the executives really starting to chime in, right? That, there's a lot of conversation on risk management of this kind of ad hoc practice and it's focused on downside. There is tremendous upside. The unknowns of downside are very concerning to people, but it's still about upside and downside, right? And I think, when we're kind of talking about, I know we're talking a lot about risk management, but that is the state of play right now. And, if there is value in strategy, the risk conversation is a strategic conversation, right? The outputs that come out of this allow informed decision making for strategic purposes. And that is the part that I think, like, when we see some of the industry struggle, or what's happening is that they lack this maturity in risk management that does kind of grind things down a little bit, like slows it down, doesn't stop it, right? People are still interested in moving forward. But I think the strategic advantage are groups and industries that really appreciate the value of strategy. And then that gets transferred down to putting effort, time, skill sets, appreciation of what risk management is and the output that it supports.
And adding on to that, there is an element of understanding the context of your use cases. When you're building out your strategy, that context is important because it tells you what that risk might be. It lets you understand the harms that are possible and understand where you need to mitigate to solve for to solve and make those less risky. And so that is all part of that business strategy, understanding the use cases that have the highest impact.
Sounds like balancing kind of a cost-benefit analysis, right? What's the advantage of using this, and what is the risk? And putting some quantitative numbers on that is the approach that you folks are advocating. Kent, do you see this happening at Chevron? I mean, it sounds like you've had lots of implementations. What is your process for navigating AI adoption?
Yeah, thanks. And I think I'm going to also pull on something Phil said. What we have is basically a program that, as I said, looks at the specific, more unique risks associated with AI but it is integrated with the data privacy group, with the cyber group, and over that, there is a long history of analysis of any project inside of Chevron dealing with trying to assess the value and risk, because Chevron doesn't do anything without assessing the risk as well. So it works inside of the Chevron system. What may not be happening as much insurance is we've already begun to elaborate, and it's really just 4 pillars to it. One is actually what are our ethical standards. The second is assessment of a project, of AI projects. Third is the governance around it, and fourth is education, because it's moving so fast that without fundamental education in a lot of these areas, people get lost very quickly. But let me speak about assessments. You have, there are different kinds of risks associated with different kinds of AI. If you are building fundamental models, if you are Meta or Google or Microsoft, or you have a large internal group developing AI algorithms for specific internal use cases, that's one kind of risk you look at and one kind of assessment. What we have found is we've got that going on. We've got people leveraging pre-existing models. We have a huge also battery of issues dealing with vendor-provided AI. And actually for us, I don't think this is news. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know. The single largest risk for a company the size of Chevron is vendor-provided AI. We can manage what our own people are doing, but it's very hard to get an insight into what a vendor is providing. So we look at these, we're basically trying to match the kind of assessment we do with the kind of fundamental baseline of who is doing it, what they're offering, and where it's going. And
actually, that's good timing, because one of the questions that just came through is the assessing a buy versus build, right? So, normally buy versus build is a straight economic decision, but in this case, there's this black box effect, right? Where something's going into a vendor, and it could be a well-established vendor like OpenAI, or it could be some tech startup in the insurtech space where we really have no idea. And it seems like there's more risk there with data privacy and governance and some of those pieces. How are you folks weighing up the risks and advantages when you go through a process? Julie, how's healthcare doing it?
It's a great question. So in our work in the healthcare space, it really is kind of boiled down to understanding what's available, and the assessment process is there's so much innovation in this space, right? And there are new products, new vendors popping up every day. How do you identify which ones are there to match the use cases that you want to solve for? Identifying those, and then kind of going through a process that we've often worked with our clients to do, is to develop a way of assessing the risks associated with that by asking for things like model cards. We always ask for the information that the vendor provides on their solution that can tell us more, give us more insight into how the AI functions, how it's been assessed from a perspective of the main bias and other harms that people are trying to mitigate for. Then looking at their reputation and things of that nature, and also kind of how difficult it would be to check on that work while you integrate it into your system. So these are some ways of thinking about the vendor solution, and then looking at okay, then what are those costs related to the cost of a homegrown solution, and kind of comparing those by doing a lot of deep dives into this work. So that's one way that healthcare is approaching it.
Yeah. Ryan, what do you see in financial services? I mean, there's obviously a wide slew of organizations and approaches.
Yeah, what I think is what I feel like is healthy that's happening with the regulators and the conversations is that everything is use case specific and context specific, which I'm finding very important. Whether that's and decisions also of buy versus build. It's really not looking at this AI umbrella under a totality of, hey, this is right, we've got AI and that's what it means. I mean, some of the challenges some of the concerns that we've been trying to address is, just broad concepts of AI and its application, right? Where machine learning has been responsibly implemented. So not taking all these concerns and risks and looking backwards versus, let's have a conversation of moving forward in the use case and context specific, right? Where risks are commensurate with controls. I think um, there are issues that are starting to pop up, like explainability, right? That become, that are manageable. But not if you take it and say, hey, here's AI, now get to everything explainable, right? Without putting in context of, what's the purpose and who's asking and what's the context and why are they asking? And, we're going to get into deep dives of the technology versus, let's talk to, the individual and how they can digest it, right? For the purpose in solving that. And so I feel like this, approach of context is absolutely critical for every conversation with regulators, with not, with individual concepts like explainability, which we have a black box. Okay, right. Let's put it in context. So how do you meet the intention of explainability? I have an intended output. I trust it. I can interpret how I got from A to B, and I'm being transparent about my process, right? Can we, in the context of how and why it's being used? And I think if we don't do that, and even with some of these decisions of, buy versus build, and right, it's really going to have to get down to granularity of, its purpose, its context, its use, the risks that come along with it. And that's going to, take this living, process moving forward.
And I think also added to that is a need to focus on the outcomes that are in the context and the impact of those outcomes. For, using healthcare example, writing an explanation of benefits has a different outcome than a clinical diagnosis support. And those outcomes affect different populations in very different ways. And understanding those outcomes and how they impact the risks associated with that and how you kind of control for those risks are important as well.
So I'm hearing from you that context is key and focusing on the end results is critical, right? What are you seeing? The two big challenges that I'm hearing is that it's a changing environment. What's changing? Well, one big challenge, but it's the two big areas where it's changing is you're dealing with technology that is changing constantly, whether it's new models being updated or the same model that's coming up with hallucinations because training data has skewed with the direction the model's going, right? So we're not dealing with a stable, consistent platform like a CRM, which is going to do the same thing every time you hit that submit button, right? You could get a different answer, right? Depending on what the vendor's doing or even internally developed systems. So we've got changing technology. And then around us, we've got this crazy changing regulatory environment. I mean, we've all seen how we'll talk about regulations in a bit. But what are you seeing in terms of how people are managing that change practically with these live AI implementations? I'm open to anybody on that question.
So this goes back to what Kent mentioned in education. Education is key in a lot of these places. So that people are aware of what to expect, what risks might emerge. We think of we categorize things in terms of safety education, readiness education, and literacy education surrounding these solutions. So with literacy, it's understanding what is possible, what isn't possible, where you can trust, things like this transparency, explainability, fairness, those approaches. Educating the users of these products in your organization about that. Safety, how to protect yourself, think of cybersecurity training, but only apply to AI. And then readiness is how to use the tools at hand. With that, there's elements of change management so that when things when there's drift happening, like you described, people can raise the red flag. Hey, this doesn't look right. Let's dig into this. I think education is key to equipping people in your organization to handle that change, as well as monitoring your solutions. That's key as well.
Do you think that AI is going so quickly, right? I think the internet took 7 years to get to 100 million users, right? From 91 to 98. Early 2000s, I think Instagram, Facebook maybe took 30 months, right? ChatGPT took 5 weeks. Okay, so cyber is a very mature space, and I like your analogy to cyber, right? But it's taken 20 years to get to this point, right? How long do you think do we need to put in responsible AI protocols for this fast evolving industry? And is there, what do you folks think in terms of leveraging? How does organizations leverage existing cyber and compliance risk management infrastructure to adapt to this? And the question is not so much actually at the large institutions, but I think the risk is really at the mid-sized institutions, right? Or possibly quote unquote unregulated industries. So let's say there's an e-commerce company selling shoes, right? It doesn't fall under any of the Fed, the FDA, the FCC, any of those kind of typical regulators. But when you think about regulating data privacy, bias, these things are germane to cyber, right? These are germane to all companies. So what do you folks think of being able to, bring this capability to kind of the mainstream corporate enterprise, which may not necessarily be the largest banks and the largest healthcare companies, the largest energy companies?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start, and maybe it's more of a comment for the larger or medium to larger enterprises. In our work, we make reference to cyber security and IT risk assessments all the time, and particularly in helping enterprises understand how they can augment existing approaches to third-party risk mitigation. Kent mentioned that vendor risk tends to pose a higher risk than the AI that is being built internally. I'm reminded of a stat from one of the large consulting firms that I think says that 60% of AI failures result from third-party AI solutions that have not been properly vetted. So we help introduce a risk assessment at the procurement phase, can complement that with insurance specific to the product, much like enterprises already do with IT risk assessments and SOC 2 and ISO 27001 compliance. There's this gap at the procurement of third-party solutions today where there are some standards that are emerging, but there is no assessment framework. It's kind of one of the reasons we joined Responsible AI Institute to begin with, frankly, to be able to have a common assessment framework for vetting vendors and their systems. So that's something I think that we see is critical. In larger enterprises, they already require an analogous form of a risk assessment at the procurement phase. It's something they understand, and they're looking for tools, the assessment frameworks, and then technology to help them do it scalably. So that's I'll say that's one of the biggest parallels that we make to the cybersecurity or cyber risk and IT risk when we're discussing AI risk with insurers or banks or financial institutions.
Yeah, and just if I may, to follow up on things that both Julie and Phil said, when we look at education, we look at in a similar way, we identify personas, so that if we know that people in the procurement space need a different kind of education than the data scientist does. When it comes to responsible AI, than executive leadership does. And I think that's, there are various ways to define that, but we just phrase it in terms of personas. And Phil brought up the other thing in which I have talked, and one of the reasons why Chevron is part of the RAI Institute as well, is if you're a mid-sized company and you're trying to manage this, one of the best hopes you have eventually is regulation, like a SOC 2, where because you can't keep, SOC 2 for RAI kind of thing. It's very, very difficult, and I don't care who you are, trying to look at a vendor without some kind of external assurance. So I think that is a hope. Before we get there, the other protection, which we all have, is see if you can talk to your attorneys, particularly in the transaction space, about what kind of clauses belong in contracts where the vendor is providing you AI. Very important for us.
Hey, Greg, to jump in on the cyberspace, and I think, this is a big conversation. I'll keep this really short, but for the last like 20 years, we've seen this shift on cyber on, this compliance attitude to this bifurcation of responsibility, where you have to, right, there's this responsibility of not being negligent, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, following standards, right, doing all the right things that practice has developed into, to eventually the regulators and courts even have gotten to the point of that there's no zero risk environment. So how are you managing your risk? And that is then there's this focus on your practice. And the gaps of I do a risk assessment and I have a risk register and I have a committee that may be a governance body but isn't governing is not risk management. Those are risk tools and risk practices. And where the regulators are now and looking at, are the right people at the table? Are you informed, right? When risks fall outside of tolerance, can you define a tolerance? And, it's not when you look at some of these programs and they say, well, I have an incident response program. An incident can cause escalation, but a risk falling outside of a tolerance can also cause escalation. And that's risk management. And we're seeing this maturity, that happened in the cyberspace that I think is the start. It feels like it's the starting point of AI. And with all of these changes that we are going to see like now and tomorrow and new models and a new model and new tools, which are new use cases, which are new risks, right? The speed of that and third parties that are using it for, that are promoting and marketing or you're interacting with has to, be managed through this, so you have a governing body, what are they governing? It's the risk program is what they're governing. And, without that, I don't think that you can manage the speed of change that is here today. And that is, going to be the continued practice moving forward. So it's not just this, do you do risk management? It's do you do it maturely, right? Is it programmatic? And I know we've kind of hit on that on a couple of pieces, but it is going to take these, organizations to really do a deep dive on what they like, is their risk practice mature? And that is, cyber notoriously has not been a mature risk practice, but insurance, incredibly mature. Risk management is a mature risk practice. And I think that those are table stakes right now, whether you're talking about third parties or, different use cases or context, right? It's got to fall in. So when you're going to educate, employees, are you going to educate them where the tolerances are? Like, what are the boundaries? Because these tools are going to be released, I'll call like into the wild. They hand it off to business units that are going to have to know what is the boundary for me to escalate before it becomes an incident. And that's the nimbleness that is going to have to happen.
So what I'm
So
hearing.
it sounds like you're, sounds like you're saying that, no, please, Julie, go ahead.
I was just saying, it sounds like what we're all saying is that for the small and medium-sized businesses, there's a little bit of put the brakes on so you can go faster.
Yes.
Happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was about to say the same thing. It sounds like because the space is evolving so quickly and there's hundreds of use cases, right, that could be applied tomorrow. And any one of those use cases, some data scientists could be doing something untoward internally or using some vendor, which could absolutely blow up the organization, regulated or not, right? Because ultimately we're talking about data, which ultimately comes down to consumers. So it sounds like the right approach here is get your ducks in a row, take your existing risk program. Everybody's got a cyber program, right? At least, right? Take that existing program, extend it to AI, enable it, and then make those decisions, ideally to quantify the risk, right? Put some numbers on the risk and reward, bring in strategy, bring in risk, put some analysis on there and get ready for it. And then you have an infrastructure in place using the responsible techniques and capabilities to be able to then go out and explore, right? And it sounds like, to your point, I love that, put the brakes on to go faster. Getting the car ready to go faster means that you can go down that highway and you've got those bumpers in place so that it's not going to veer off and cause a 10 car pileup. I love that analogy. We've only got a few minutes left. Before we do that, I just want to, before we finish, and I want to open up to Q&A if we have some time, but I just want to ask you folks, regulations, right? And, Kent, you talked about the external assurance. So we've got best practices, right? Organizations internally taking a look, how are we managing this risk? The space is evolving so quickly, models, it's not the same as it was before. Put in our own infrastructure, get ready to manage that risk internally. What about externally especially in regulated industries? I mean, we've all seen the EU AI Act come in place, and it's been effective, maybe too effective, right? People are claiming that it's stifling innovation. I'm sure you folks know that Apple Intelligence is not available in Europe, right? Twitter, X is being sued by the Data Protection Commission in Ireland. Meta, right? Facebook's Meta Llama 3 open source platform, which is a treasure for the industry, right? This really will move the needle forward by making it open source, not available in Europe because of data privacy concerns. And people in Europe and the innovation side are screaming. They're saying, hold on a second, we're being shut out. And it has to have real consequences. In the same token, in the US, we see SB Senate bill proposed, California Senate Bill 1047 shot down by Governor Newsom, saying this is going to stifle innovation. So where do you folks see innovation? What is the right way? How do we get to that external assurance, right? Ultimately, regulators are going to be asking for this. What are your opinions from these diverse industries in terms of people can self-regulate and put in process, but where do you think this is going from an industry perspective? Because the regulators are 2 steps behind industry or 2 steps behind technologists. So there's a lot to learn.
Hey, Greg, gonna put a plug in here for the Regverse think tank.
Okay, sure.
So, the conversation with regulators, I think some of the fear is that you have this hodgepodge of state laws, of, regulatory interpretation on issues that I think is going to be important for consistency and just general speed of use of digitalization and tools like AI, where when we have these conversations at the Regverse think tank, part of it is interpretation with multiple industries and what does this mean and where are we going, and tell me about your risk practice and what have you learned from regulation that is important, that is effective, right, that is sound, that is balanced, so that when we do have issues like explainability, that you don't have a different interpretation of what that means and how to satisfy that by 7 different regulated industries and multiple regulators within an industry. And so, these conversations that we're having at the think tank, I think are incredibly important because there is good practice baked into that. There is balance. We're trying to avoid overregulation, which, oftentimes comes from a lack of interpretation or a lack of a nomenclature, like defining what AI is, what is explainability, like all these concepts. So, it is important that we kind of move together in a lot of ways. The fear is that we end up with these, hodgepodge of laws like privacy that are just really impossible to navigate and become incredibly inefficient and, time consuming and resource intensive to, even just to follow.
Unintended consequences, right? I mean, nobody wants that. That's hard for the industry to predict.
The intentions are right. Yes.
The intentions are right. Exactly. Yeah, I agree with you. Having a dialogue, with everybody. Patrick, can I ask you to bring up a slide? So we have a treat for you folks, the attendees. We actually have a list of resources here, which could be helpful for you folks moving forward. These are all free, available online, and we want to just point out some tools and some resources available for folks who attended here today to kind of get their head around this a little bit more. So obviously, the Responsible AI Institute has some amazing content, and feel free to look through all the resources they have, especially recently the cyber work a paper on how to manage cyber and AI, I think is particularly valuable. At the AI Reg Risk think tank, we have a free survey for folks to go to just to do a self-assessment. There's 14 simple questions to get a sense of where folks stand from an AI perspective. How ready are they? And also the result of that is you'll get some interesting benchmark analysis and some heat maps to kind of point out some risk areas. Harvard University has some really interesting things about applied ethics, right? So ethics is moving from conceptual to applied, because now we actually have to bring some of that capabilities into these types of solutions. And then, of course, the further group, Julie's group, has some excellent work about innovation and privacy, which I would encourage reading as well. Chevron, of course, is showing themselves to be a real kind of thought leader in the space, and Kent was kind enough to provide some kind of overview in terms of how Chevron thinks about the world around innovation while managing social responsibility. And then, of course, anybody wanting to do business with governments, the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, I think, has put out some guidance around working with the government and the government's thoughts about AI. So lots of great resources out there. We've only got 2 minutes left. Any last minute questions? Open to anybody who wants to pop in a question at the last minute here. But if not, I would like to say thank you to you folks for joining us today. I hope this was productive. Thank you to RIA for kind of putting this out there for everybody. We love the work that they're doing, and you panelists have really provided this. Hopefully we'll be able to come back and talk more about so many other topics. We only got halfway through our agenda, but clearly this is an interesting, innovative space, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you folks. Let's see, just some final last. Okay, we'll be sending around the slide to everybody. So thank you, Patrick, for the reminder there. We'll be sending around the slide to everybody, so you have some of those resources, and we look forward to your ongoing engagement in this conversation. Any last words from the panelists? Any thoughts? Any kind of crystal ball in terms of anything we haven't said today that people absolutely need to hear at this point of moving AI from concept to practical application, especially learning from regulated industries?
Build on what you know.
Interesting. Pump the brakes to go faster. I love that. Very smart. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day. And thank you for being here today. And this was a terrific panel. Thanks so much.